Support for your public radio station comes from our members and from Mary Cariola Center, providing education and life skills solutions designed to empower individuals and the families of those with complex disabilities. Mary Cariola Center, transforming lives of people with disabilities. More at marycariola.org.
From WXXI News, this is Connections. I'm Evan Dawson. Our connection this hour was made last Friday when Brighton Town Supervisor Bill Maley made an announcement. The town, Maley said, would be canceling its town-wide property reassessment. The move came after much public outcry. As reported by WXXI News, hundreds of Brighton homeowners challenged their assessments or reassessments. Some said they saw their home values double. The town canceled the assessment process since, as Maley said, it could not accommodate the number of challenges. The debate over assessments is as hot as the local real estate market. Recently on this program, President and CEO of the Greater Rochester Association of Realtors, Jim Yockel, said that 10 years ago, there would have been roughly 3,000 homes on the market in the Greater Rochester region. Today, there are 500. Yockel says Rochester is now the worst housing market in the country in regards to supply versus demand. With supply as low as it is, home prices are rapidly rising, leading to changes with assessments and the tax burden. Town leaders in Gates are holding 2 public information sessions about its reassessment process this week. Meanwhile, in Henrietta, Town Supervisor Steve Schultz has been answering homeowners' questions about assessments, the rise in home prices, and concerns about a shifting tax burden. Schultz says the assessment process is broken, needs an overhaul. So how would he do it? What questions or concerns about assessments do you have wherever you live? This hour, we're going to try to talk as much as we can to answer your questions about how assessments work, property tax laws, and what homeowners ought to know about their situation. And I'd like to welcome our guest. The Henrietta Town Supervisor, Stephen Schultz, is with us. Steve, thank you for making time for the program today.
My pleasure.
And in studio, Brian Sharp is Investigations and Enterprise Editor for WXXI News. Thank you for being in the studio here.
Thank you.
Gino Finelli, thanks for coming down one floor, Investigations and City Hall reporter for WXXI News.
Yeah, thank you.
And, Gino, you and I on this program talked a lot about your reporting, the team's reporting on the Rochester reassessment, which got a ton of attention. So in a sense, I get a little surprised that there is drama. I mean, no, there's going to be drama, but any surprise that towns may have. And I'm not, I don't know what Supervisor Maley is dealing with, and I'm sure there's a lot of hullabaloo trying to get things lined up and communicated well. But is there any surprise that you have that there are towns dealing with this level of either backlash or controversy?
Not particularly, and I'd say for 2 reasons. One, as we saw in the city of Rochester, and probably throughout the show, I'm going to be referring to the Rochester reassessment a good bit because it was a real harbinger of what was kind of to come in a lot of the suburbs around it. But there were very large increases that were not limited to the city of Rochester. So when Greece did its assessment, and then when Brighton did its assessment, you saw these really, really large increases. And 2 weeks ago when I reported on the Brighton assessment, we had one guy who had his house go up by $500,000. It almost tripled in value, in assessed value. So that's one thing. Just the sheer numbers are shocking to people when they see them. But the other part, too, and we saw this a lot with the Rochester reassessment, is a lot of people don't really understand how assessments work. An educational campaign is a very key portion of how you do an assessment. And so there is always confusion about what it actually means, what the impact is going to be. And then as I think Steve could talk a little bit more about, because I was reading through some of his notes on this, and I sometimes and pretty often the way the assessments are set up is that they disproportionately impact more traditionally lower valued houses. And I think we can get more into some of the concerns with that. But I think there's a trifecta of reasons there of how suburbs, as they were doing their reassessments, could have expected this kind of backlash and this reaction to what happened. And in Brighton, you saw the average house double in assessed value. So yeah, that number was going to be something that struck people a little hard.
Well, sure. I mean, in Rochester, if I'm remembering your reporting correctly, it was an average value increase of 65%?
67,
I mean,
it
was in that range, right?
68.
And that was eye-opening for people. So to see a 100% increase is I mean, I can understand why people are shocked. So in Brighton, my understanding, Brian and Gino, is that a tentative assessment roll will be issued May 1st. Is that what's happening, Brian?
Yeah, they're going to go back to what they had. If you made major improvements, your home value will reflect that. But otherwise, they haven't done a reassessment since 2018, so those numbers have generally carried forward. So they're going to stick with that. And then when I talked to the supervisor, their Supervisor Maley, he had said, because the question is, well, doing it again or going back at this process in another year or two or whenever it is, you're still going to see that increase. What is going to be different? And kind of what Gino's touched on, and the supervisor will be talking, I'm sure, about is his thing was we got to do more messaging up front. He thought they did some. Obviously, it was clear to do more, and then leave themselves a longer runway, because the goal is to get it right, have people have faith in the process, and make sure people have their values that they feel are reflective. And go forward from there. And they had 1,000 slots for challenges and a waiting list of hundreds. And they had left themselves about 6 weeks.
Wow. And just as an example of that, I want to grab this phone call from Philip in Brighton, who wants to just describe his story. What happened with you, Philip?
So 1 week before the deadline for the informal review, we got the letter in the mail. I get packages from China faster than I got this letter because it was dated March 1st. And we were shocked. I mean, we bought our house in 2004 for $180,000, and then the last assessment, and it's been adjusted because of the amount. I guess they kind of take that into account a little. It was $225K, and now I'm sitting in a $487K palace.
It went from 225 to 487.
Yes, 487, and that number. I mean, I understand that we're only paying a portion of a pie. And what the assessment's all about is how much of a percentage of that portion you're paying. But the number that got me, and I can't tell you whether it's real or not, but was the estimate number of what you will pay in an increased tax, taking all this into account, assuming nothing else changes, was $2,005 a year. And we're already paying, that puts us at $12K, 7 to 8,000 of that's for our school district that likes to put in AstroTurf on school fields. And if they wanted gold bricks for the sidewalk, the school district, they get it in this town. I mean, they just approve everything. And $2,005 more, considering our income, and our expenses and things, that's a number that makes us take advantage of that property value because we'd have to sell and move. And that's the problem. I've lived on Elmwood Avenue my entire life. I'm 57 years old. These property value increases, they're really nice when you sell. But I don't want to sell. I don't want to move. I like it here. I've been here all my entire life. And I can't really take advantage of that wonderful property value unless I borrow against it. And what it does is it puts people like me at risk of being, I guess, it's gentrified right out of the town because it's simply becoming unaffordable to live here, assuming that $2,005 number is right, and taxes are already astounding here in the town. And by the way, that informal review, I immediately jumped on it to try and, okay, what do we need to do? This is an all-hands-on-deck situation, and basically, for that informal review, you need to show up with appraisals and repair estimates, because I'm telling you right now, my house is not appreciated in value to that degree because we haven't made any major changes. I have a kitchen that has a wet bar in it, and that tells you 1980s.
Wow.
So it's just it puts people like me, into a really difficult situation.
Yeah. And I want to say to Philip, first of all, thank you for sharing what's going on with you. And Philip's story, so going from buying at 180 in 2004, reassessed at 225, and then this reassessment goes from 225 to 487. That is higher than the average by a little in Brighton, but it's not the highest reassessment you heard in your reporting, is it, Gino?
No, it's not. I mean, we saw one that was about it went from around 250K original assessed value to I think it was 826 is where it ended up as. Not a particularly, nice house. Not particularly remarkable. They hadn't really done anything to it. So,
if Brighton is California, people are going to move. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
That's under the assumption people are actually moving to Brighton in droves, which I don't know is the case.
Well, I don't know. So in a second, we're going to get the Henrietta perspective here. Brian Sharp, anything to add here? I mean, I think it's important to note here. I already have emails, people saying, well, shouldn't towns just say we're not going to reassess? You know, people don't want it, so just don't do it. So that's Brian looked right over and said, you got a supervisor here. He's going to answer that question. But Brighton is going to move forward with more communication on this and a spring rollout here of this assessment process.
Yeah, well, essentially, I mean, they've got to certify a role, and so they will go ahead, like I say, sort of largely staying static and making adjustments for, you know, major improvements was what I was told, and that this is done for this year, and they'll regroup and come back at a future time. But yeah, the Supervisor Schultz here can talk a lot more about sort of the process and you know what other options there might be.
So I'm going to give it over to Supervisor Steve Schultz of the town of Henrietta. I want you to describe what's happened in Henrietta, how you see the assessments overall. I think people are curious to know your thoughts about your neighbor, Rush, which, you know, tried to intervene in its own way with reassessments. Can you take us through all of that?
Sure. So, you know, a couple misconceptions that you always hear about assessments is that it's a money grab. Raising assessments does not bring in 1 penny more for a municipality, nor does lowering assessment bring in 1 penny less. As was stated earlier, the assessments divvy up the tax levy. The tax levy is set at budget time. In fact, when schools put their budgets together, the assessment rolls aren't even done, so they can't possibly know what the assessments are going to be. They are two separate things. The problem with the current system and with this current market is it's shifting the tax burden from the higher end homes to the lower end homes, and that's because the lower end homes are rising faster. So, you know, I went and pulled a bunch of homes from real estate, looking at ones that have recently sold. So we're working with real numbers. This is what they actually sold for, not what someone said they're worth.
Yep.
This is what someone was willing to pay for them. And so, like a mid-level home, you know, from in any of the homes from like the 2000 through 2018. So, for instance, this one house, over that 18 years, it grew 4%. That's it, 4% in value. From 2018 to 2022, so now a 4-year span, it grew by 45%.
This is in Henrietta?
This is in Henrietta.
Yep.
Over the last 2 years, it grew by 72%. So
of what it actually sold for?
It's sold for 72% higher than it was valued 2 years earlier.
Again, these aren't theoretical
These aren't
valuations.
theoretical.
This is what it's actually selling for.
This is what it sold at. So when they bought the house, they bought it for $125,000. It sold for over $290,000. So that's an entry-level home. Meanwhile, you have a mid-level home. They bought it for $227,000. It just sold for $429,000. So that's more between 90 and 100% increase over that life of the span. But, you know, in terms of the growth, you know, so that's over 6 years. That's a 6-year growth. That's not unusual. That's essentially what Brighton is seeing now. So it is what the market is doing, but it's, you know, the challenge you've got is there are people overpaying for homes. So my cousin's children they've spent 3 years looking for a home. They would constantly get outbid. So what a lot of these buyers do, they take the money they were going to put on a larger home and they put that same money down for a smaller home, and that's the only way they can get a home. These homes come in.
And they bid over asking.
They have to bid over asking. You know, when we bought the house across the street from us for my father-in-law, it was assessed at $130,000. It was listed for $170,000, and the only reason we got it is we had an escalator clause that went up to $185,000. Without that, we wouldn't have gotten the house. And the other thing that's happening is because you've got these real estate firms that they're real estate venture firms that they're buying houses and turning them into rental properties, they're coming in with fully non-contingent offers. So if you want to buy a house, you have to waive your right of inspection. And, you know, the real estate investment firms can get away with that because if they lose one house, it might be one out of hundreds. If it's your only house and you buy a house that has a real problem, that's horrible. That's something Albany could and should change today, that you cannot be forced to waive your right of inspection. It's just, you know, like I said, the market's going crazy. And so what we're seeing is that, our average increase on this reassessment was 35%. Ours is less than Brighton's because we, up until recently, have stayed at 100% valuation by doing partial reassessments. And when the growth was low, you could get away with that. But with the growth like this, you can't, because, if I'm growing 45% in 1 year, then anyone who wasn't reassessed, they're getting a 45% discount essentially on their taxes. It's just not fair. So we've had to switch to a cyclical recycle. And to answer the question, the penalty for not reassessing is something called an equalization rate penalty. So what that does is it increases all your tax rates. So if you go out to the county has all the town tax rates out there. Folks in Webster pay close to $10 per thousand on their county tax bill, whereas in Henrietta it's around $5. The reason is they haven't reassessed in forever.
So they get penalized for that?
They get penalized for that, and that change not only increases your tax rate, but it also reduces any exemptions you have on your house. So a senior who might have a senior limited exemption, in Webster, they're only getting 52% of that exemption.
What happened in Rush?
So in Rush, the town board voted to overturn the assessment.
After a lot of outcry?
After a lot of outcry, and that's not legal. As elected officials, we cannot change the assessment. It's the assessor who has to make that decision. And we changed assessor about a year and a half ago, and when she came in, there was talk about doing a reassessment last year in Henrietta, and she basically said, you know what, we're not set up for it. This is going to be a massive effort. It's going to be all kinds of problems, and so she's had her team spend the year getting ready for this reassessment now. We have what's called a coordinated assessment program, so the same assessor that serves Henrietta also serves Rush. And so she put all the stuff together. They had all the informals. They got the packages out. They got the information out. There's still people who they don't read. In a post I had put that explained that this is our first townwide that we've done in 2 decades, they said, no, the town reassessed. Well, right in it, I said we do partials. So people unfortunately don't always read. You can only educate so much, but, there's nothing a politician, a town board member, hates more than reassessments.
Because, again, I want to put a point on what the supervisor said. If you see your assessment going up by 35% or 68% in Rochester or whatever it was, or 100% in Brighton, that does not mean your town just gets more money. That's not how that works. So a couple questions I have, and then I want my colleagues to kind of run the show because Brian and Gino do such great work reporting on this, and we'll take your calls and emails as well coming up here as we talk reassessments. First of all, Mr. Supervisor, I see a growing, I don't know if consensus is the word, but a growing opinion that in a lot of places in this country, including obviously our region now, a big part of this problem is simply supply and demand and how hard it is to build new housing. So you have regulations, something in place that makes it hard to build multifamily, to build new homes in general. The Home Association recently was on this program saying the same thing. Do you agree with that assessment that we are now paying the price of not building enough new housing?
I can't speak for other towns. In Henrietta, we grew by 11%. We would have actually grown by 17% if RG&E had enough power for us. We have over 1,000 units that are on hold right now because we can't get power.
Why is that?
They allowed the capacity at our primary substation to reach 0 additional capacity, and they haven't ordered they hadn't ordered the new transformer. Come COVID pandemic, there's this huge backlog for them. It's also they're competing with all these new computing centers, which are all whether it's AI or cyber mining for Bitcoin and stuff like that. Those generally have their own substation, so they have their own transformers. It's a 4-year backlog on getting transformers. So right now we have about 500 jobs on hold and over 1,000 housing units on hold because there's just no power. In
general, do you think in this country it's too hard to build new housing?
There's a lot of places where that is true. You look at one of the things I've found when we have public hearings for new projects is the general sentiment, and they don't come out and say this, but now that my house is built, we don't need any more homes in town, right?
Sure.
I want to preserve, one of the ones that killed me, we had a development that was done in 3 stages, and the folks from stage 2 were complaining about stage 3 that it was going to displace the deer. Well, what do you think your house did, right? We work hard to preserve the feel of the town, but we've also worked hard to find where can we put those housing units. So, for instance, right, a lot of people say we need affordable housing. People don't want them in their backyard, often referred to as NIMBY, not in my backyard. So where did we put them? Well, you got the Marketplace Mall, which is going down. So we worked with Cornerstone Group, and they put an affordable senior housing project, the Marketplace Senior Housing, right in the mall. It's not anybody's backyard. Nobody complained about it. Oh, by the way, the first day they opened that up for sign up, they reached 150% capacity on day 1. So we need more of those. It's a challenge to find where they can go. And again, the problem we're facing right now is getting them power.
So what would you do if you were redesigning the assessment system? How should this go?
Just get away from market value. So rising market value is not a reason to raise someone's share of the taxes. And again, I want to stress we don't get additional taxes, but it does change how much you pay. Right. And I'll use an example. So going back to, I mentioned we bought my father-in-law's house. It went from $180,000 to $300,000. That's a 66% increase. My house, which I built after the sale of my company, went from $650,000 to $850,000. And I'm just rounding the numbers to make the math easier. That's a 30% increase. Our average increase was 35%. That means my tax burden on the large home is going to come down by a couple $100. My tax burden on the small home is going to go up by $1,000. And that's assuming that nobody increases taxes, which we already know isn't true because the school has a 4.2% proposed increase. So it's shifting the tax burden from the large homes to the small homes. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm still paying 3 times as much taxes on the big home, but it used to be 4x. And if you go back 6 years, it used to be 5x. So it's shifting that tax burden to the people who can least afford it. It's broken. And even just the whole concept, you can put 10 real estate professionals in front of a house and say, how much is it worth? And you're probably going to get 10 different answers. It's always going to create, argument, confusion. People don't understand how it works. You always hear, well, I didn't make any improvements and my house went up that much. Well, that's just because that's what the real estate market is doing. And that's what the law says. You have to, we would love to be able to say, you know what, let's not raise the assessment as much on small homes. We don't have that ability. It's dictated by law.
So what would have to change for you to get the system you want?
So it would have to change in Albany.
Yeah.
And basically what I would love to see it go to is a formula based off of measurables, right? Square footage living area, square footage non-living area, things like basements, garages, sheds, acreage, number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, linear of lake frontage for those who have it. And you just put different weights on these things. And so what happens is I put all the foreign stuff in for my house and it spits out a number. And that's my assessed value. It doesn't need to be dollars. It's just some number to compare the homes. Well, now what happens if I don't change my house, my assessment doesn't change. Reassessments go away forever. In Henrietta, that would save $500,000 a year because that's how costly it is to do reassessments. Between salaries and the professional folks we have to pay to help with the process, and then, of course, all of the commercial properties file certiorari lawsuits fighting their assessments afterwards. We have to fight all those in court. And that's just one town. There's over 900 towns in New York State. Now, granted, we're a larger town and small towns don't pay that much. But, you're probably looking at, across the state, hundreds of millions of dollars in savings. And that doesn't even get to the state, who has all these offices of real property tax services who review every single municipality in the state to determine the level of assessment. And they're the ones who assign that penalty so that when taxes that cross town borders, they're done equally. Because again, using Webster as an example, they haven't reassessed it forever. They're at 52% level of assessment. We're at 92%. Some towns are at 100%. It wouldn't be fair to have the same tax rate.
Okay, but any support in Albany for your idea?
I don't know yet. I've gotten to some people's ears. Unfortunately, right now it's budget time, so getting on their schedule is difficult. But I've definitely been having a number of conversations with Senator Jeremy Cooney. I can tell you what I hear all the time from all the residents is, how can we help? How can we get this message to Albany? And there's even stuff that they might be able to potentially do to help with the situation right now. It would only help seniors, but there's a senior limited income benefit. Now, you can't change who's eligible and have it affect this year because there's a taxable status date of March 1st. But one of the things they could potentially do is there's 3 income tiers, and the lowest tier you get 20% reduction in your assessed value. The mid tier is 10%, and the lowest tier is 5%. They could double all those so that seniors on limited income who they won't have the means to pay the larger share of taxes, they could get a greater deduction this year, but they would have to pass that in time. The final roll goes out July 1st, so it has to be in place, I would say, probably by the end of May, so that the towns can implement that and fold it into their roll calculations.
Brian?
Oh, I was just going to jump in when he was talking about the, Webster at 52%, Henrietta, just for perspective, if folks are curious, Brighton's at 65%. And if you're East Siders thinking Penfield, Barrington, Fairport, Pittsford, you're all right around that 65 or less, 62, 66, right in that general area. So just if people are wondering, where do I fall?
Okay. What else stands out to you, Gino Finelli?
I think everything that Supervisor Schultz has said is very refreshing. I've had a lot of conversations with different local leaders about assessments, and you often really get the response, and not trying to call anyone out in particular, but well, why are the assessments going up this amount? I mean, how do you justify a 130% increase in a neighborhood? And it's well, people just love it here. The food's great. It's a good location, good schools, whatever it might be. And you also have to factor in, and probably much, much larger factors, that we have an aging housing stock in this area. There's not that much development on single family homes in Monroe County itself until you get out into the, further out suburbs. Couple that with speculative real estate investment, particularly spiking up during COVID, with a lot of real estate investors buying up properties for rentals here. This had a massive impact on the market. And when you look at, again, I'll go back to Rochester when we did our reassessment, and the neighborhood that saw the biggest increase was in Beechwood, Garrison, Webster Avenue, a little bit east of the public market. Not that remarkable of a neighborhood as far as any kind of development happening there. 137% increase. Those are the people that own homes there are the ones who are going to see the largest increase in their taxes as a result of this large spike for lower valued homes. And it raises the question of what exactly is driving that. And I would argue that, the lack of stock is part of it, and the investment marketplace is a massive contributor to the local home sales contributing to that assessment increase.
Yeah, I mean, so again, the math matters here. We try to do very little math on this program, but if you own $1 million home and your reassessment is now $100,000 higher, so now it's $1.1 million, versus if you have a $100,000 home and it goes up $100,000 to $200,000, the lesser valued home is now paying a lot more in taxes. The person who has $1 million home, and now $1.1 million, is going to have a slightly smaller tax bill. So it's just based on the percentages. And your reporting on Beechwood was an eye opener for how this process is affecting people. And so I will be curious to see what happens, in Brighton as they kind of get ready to kind of redo this in May and try to communicate? And go ahead. Go ahead,
so
Brian.
they're
Yeah.
not going to redo anything this year. Yeah,
That's the wrong word.
They're just
Thank you.
sticking. And I would just, while I got the mic, is the one thing I would say is I think what Supervisor points out, there should be more of an appetite in Albany. I mean, the governor is going around how many times? Affordability. It's the affordability agenda. Well, you could start here. And shifting to folks who are trying to get started, and penalizing them the most. And I would just say, though, also, like, we bought our house. We bought in Brighton right before the pandemic, like months before. This issue of waiving the exemption or waiving the inspection, people willing to pay cash only, it was tough to get in then. And that's what we confronted was, and this was an individual buyer, cash only, waive the inspection. No, I'll just take the house. And so I can only imagine trying to get in there now.
Mr. Supervisor, go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the things that towns can do, and we have implemented this, one of the things that why you're seeing the entry-level homes increase as well is they're not building new ones, right? I grew up in a town, a baby boomer town. All the homes were 900 to 1,100 square foot. They're all building 2,000 plus square foot homes because from a builder standpoint, there's more profit in it, right? If you think about it, the cost to bring the water, sewer, road, sidewalk, all that is the same regardless of the size of the house. If I can get more from the sale of the house, I'm going to turn better profit. One of the things the governor has always said, well, just double the density everywhere. She had proposed that for a while to try to, encourage new building. Well, the problem is some of these neighborhoods, the infrastructure couldn't support it. There's a lot of these sewers. You try to put double the number of, whether it's auxiliary dwelling units, the sewers aren't going to be able to handle it. But the other thing that will happen is, even if it's cheaper for the house to build, they're always going to sell at market value. A developer's not going to say, you know what, I saved $50,000 on this home, so I'm going to sell it $50,000 under market value. That's not going to happen. They're going to pocket that difference. So what the towns can do, and again, we've done this, is we have incentives for people to build smaller homes. So you have your standard densities, and we increase the density if you're willing to build a smaller home. So we just had somebody who, instead of building 120, 200 or 2,000 square foot homes, they're going to build over 220 homes that are all less than 1,200 square feet, and they're going to have a first floor bedroom so that they're also good for seniors who are looking to downsize. So towns can put that incentive into their zoning to make it to essentially encourage these developers, because one of the things you can do then is, everyone likes the big wide open neighborhoods with the spread apart. Again, where I grew up, it was maybe 20 feet between homes, just wide enough for a driveway and a 5-foot strip of grass. But what that does is that brings down the cost, because again, now that's that much less water, sewer, electric, road, sidewalk per house. So that's how you can encourage the builders. If they can get greater density, they will build smaller houses because they can then make the money on it.
We're going to take Bill and Lisa's phone calls in just a second here. And we got to get our only break of the hour in, and we'll come right back to your phone calls as we talk reassessments. Brian Sharp and Gino Finelli from WXXI News have been leading the reporting on this. And maybe where you live, it has been, I don't know if controversial is the right word, or just difficult, challenging. We are seeing assessments increase at rates that for a long time people have said would be unsustainable. Well, now the question is, what do you do with this? Should you challenge it? So we'll talk to the supervisor more, because probably the system doesn't become the Steve Schultz system overnight, although maybe Albany will appoint him the reassessment czar in the future. But he's the supervisor of the town of Henrietta. He's joining us as well. Your phone calls on the other side of this break.
Support for your public radio station comes from our members and from Excellus Blue Cross Blue Shield, with a mission to address health inequities by building up communities and breaking down health barriers. Excellus Blue Cross Blue Shield, everybody benefits. More at excellusbcbs.com.
No surprise, we've got a lot of comments on this subject. Bill in Rochester first. Hey, Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, earlier you were saying that just because you're generating more revenue from the increased assessments, that doesn't mean that those extra funds are going to the town. Where are they going if they're not going to the town or the county or the state?
Yeah, the answer, Supervisor Schultz explained, there is not extra revenue overall. There's a rebalancing of who's paying what. So, Mr. Supervisor?
The easiest way to think of it, picture a pie, a pizza pie. When I set the tax levy, I determine the size of that pizza. So let's say it's now a 16-inch pizza, and I have to cut it up amongst 16 people who are going to eat the pizza. If I make one of those slices bigger, that person gets more pizza, but I'm not creating more pizza. The other slices have to get smaller. So if for everybody whose portion of the taxes went up, somebody else's portion of the taxes went down. Ultimately, when you add it all up, the changes equal zero. And you know, again, it's set by the tax levy. The tax levy set during budget time is what determines how much we collect, not the assessments. Assessments determine how big a portion you pay. Unfortunately, the sheet that comes out, that gets mailed out to everybody, that's dictated by the state, and it has a because it does say this is how much more you will pay in taxes, and people think, oh, well, the town or the school is getting that extra taxes. That's not the case. It should say this is how much bigger your share of the taxes will be.
Which I think, and maybe it's something that you had said, oftentimes when there is a reassessment, the tax rate goes down.
Yeah, so for 5 years in a row, we held our tax rate or our tax levy flat. We charged the same tax levy all 5 years. Our tax rate went from $1.40 per thousand to 98 cents per thousand over those 5 years because the home values were still growing, but the tax levy was the same. Therefore, and when you map it out, you see the tax levy is a straight line. The assessed values ramp up. The tax rate ramps down at the exact same angles.
Does that answer the question, Bill?
Well, it's confusing, right? Because you would expect if the average assessment's going up, say, 30%, that the revenue should go up 30%. But you're saying, no, that's not the case. The revenue stays flat even though the assessments are going up 30%, right?
I'm not saying that whether the assessment. Let me rephrase it. If they tax.
In other words, what's the relationship between increased assessment and the overall revenue?
Zero.
So then the overall revenue may be the same, even though assessments are higher, right?
Correct. And conversely,
and that's hard to figure out.
It is. Conversely, the levy or the assessments could go down, but if they raise the levy, your taxes will go up. Now, again, what happens is, unfortunately, what we're seeing is, as we've talked about. So in Henrietta, the average rate is 35%. If your house increased at a rate greater than 35%, your share will get larger. If your house increased by less than 35%, your share will get smaller. When you add it all up, it's the same, but again, how much we collect in taxes is set at budget time.
Yeah, and it's kind of important to note here, too, that there's a 2% tax cap overall. So municipalities can't just... if their assessment value goes up 68% for the residential properties, they can't just increase the tax levy to get 68% more revenue. They legally cannot do that to begin with. So it's all just shift between properties of who's paying what and at what rate they're paying. So there really is very little connection between that and revenue.
All right, let's see if that settles it for Bill. Is that better?
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, Bill, thank you for the call. And by the way, Bill's question is probably the single most common one on this subject, and it was a really good one. Thank you, Bill. Lisa in Rochester next. Hi, Lisa, go ahead.
Hi. You've got inner ring suburbs people there for the most part that you were talking about for their towns. I'm wondering if part of the investor issue, the investor part of this that I think Jeremy mentioned, is the short-term rental market. Because, like in the South Wedge, Highland Park, and Swilberg areas, in the last 5 years, we've seen a huge number of houses, not just bought by investors that were previously owner-occupied, but investors who are turning them into short-term rentals. They're not buying in Browncroft or in the very large house range. They're buying in the medium range that mostly are seniors. And so I'm wondering if that's part of what you're seeing. The city is looking to change its laws potentially to allow more short-term rentals. And and I'm wondering if you all are experiencing the same investor interest in your medium-sized and smaller homes.
Okay, Supervisor Schultz?
We haven't seen a ton of it in Henrietta. I'm not saying that it's not existing, but I've not seen that as being the big issue. And part of it is our tax rates are the lowest in the county, other than Riga, which has the landfill pay their property taxes. We're just seeing a lot of people who want to move to the town, including folks from downstate who, now that they can work remotely, are saying, why am I living downstate where there's all these issues? I'm going to move upstate. But I do know that there are other towns in the city who are facing what she's talked about. I don't know if either of you gentlemen have seen anything about that.
Yeah, I don't know about town. I mean, I used to live in the South Wedge, and I know we saw that happening on our street. I mean, it's another set of buyers, and I think in the South Wedge, particularly in just years past, you would see that area was one of the fastest increasing areas. You're right by the university, of course, so short-term rentals would make sense for investors wanting to do that.
Okay. Gino, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, that's my neighborhood. I live there, South Wedge, Highland area. And, I mean, there definitely are a lot of short-term rentals that are popping up. A lot of it's student housing, too, that they turn, family residential housing into, units for, 4 or 5 students to live in. So
I was interpreting short-term rental more like the Airbnb and Vrbo and that type of stuff.
We're seeing those.
That's
too.
what, that's what I was meaning.
If we're talking students, we do have that problem. We have a number of folks who buy up houses in, family residential neighborhoods, turn them into senior or student housing, and that not only takes them off the market, it also then creates conflicts between college students who might want to party and families who are raising young kids and want it to be quiet at night while those kids are sleeping. Unfortunately, I would love to be able to. There was talk about allowing towns to do this, that you could designate in your zoning to say this is a family neighborhood and it's owner-occupied only. Unfortunately, you can't. We don't have the authority to do that. That would help with that problem, absolutely.
All right, let's go as fast as we can. We have a lot of feedback here. Matthew and Henrietta next. Hello, Matthew. Go ahead.
Hi. I think the previous caller hit on almost all of my questions, so it may have been completely answered by now. But I was kind of talking to the same point that in my neighborhood in Henrietta, quite a few of our residents are now owned by absentee management companies, and so when I look at their assessment values and their properties in general, they're in decline. Their assessment value increases are not nearly as significant as mine. I put quite a bit of money into my property, and it's kind of the feeling that you're being penalized for being a long-term resident, and you're almost, better off not being in that boat, and having to pay that increased tax share.
That is one of the things in that piece I put in the town newsletter, and I'd sent it to you, that talks about some of the problems with the current system. That's one of them. You get penalized for keeping your property looking nice. You let it go downhill, you're going to pay less in taxes because they lower the condition. It's not as valuable on the market. That's 100% backwards from where it should be, right? You should get a reduction in your taxes for keeping your property up, and or potentially a penalty for letting it slide. It's crazy.
And I'm just wondering, I don't know the answer to this. So if you buy a house, carve it up into multiple apartments, does that then get assessed in a different way than it was when it was a single family?
Typically, they don't carve it up. We don't have many houses big enough to carve up into multiple. They just rent to 4 or 5. Theoretically, they're only supposed to be able to rent to 3. What a lot of them do is only 3 are on the lease, and the other one is a guest. And of course, one of the things I always talk about, we have great freedoms in this country with regards to, no unauthorized search and seizure. Well, that also creates headaches if you're trying to enforce this code, right? We have no means to go in and inspect to see, are there really 4 people living there? Mm-hmm. So the one thing that there's a discount out there that's crazy, we had this one neighborhood where he came, got approval, he was building all these homes, he was going to sell all the homes. Well, he turns out he didn't sell any of them. He turned them into rentals. Now he has said, well, it's essentially an apartment complex, and those, for some crazy reason, condos, there is a discount for condos in complexes as compared to regular homes. So this guy is now paying, who's making money off these houses, is paying less in taxes than if those individuals own their own houses. That is completely backwards. I just don't understand it. We've taken them to court, and unfortunately a judge ruled in his favor improperly. So, for instance, it's a public road. It's, he basically came out, the area that he's in doesn't allow for multifamily, and yet he's essentially gotten past zoning laws by swearing that he was going to sell all the homes and then turn around and rented them all. So there's absolutely problems with the current real property tax code in terms of that. It doesn't make sense to me that somebody who's making profit off of a building, if anything, anybody who buys that and turns around and rents it, they should be paying more in taxes than if the person just owned it for their own house.
Talking assessments and reassessments, let's keep it moving fast here. A lot to get to. Jen in Rochester next. Hi, Jen. Go ahead.
Hi, I had a question about, I'm not sure if they can talk to the training that the assessors have. I actually spoke to an attorney about my assessment, and it was sort of explained to me that the rate that my house was being assessed at was at 110%. And it didn't really take, it had 5 flat comparables. None of them touched on the fact that, for example, my house actually backs right up to 590. So the comparables were compared to houses that had been prepped and ready for sale on the market. When my house, I've lived in it for 15 years. So is there assessor training by New York State? Can you tell me about the assessor that you work with? And how do they work for multiple towns and districts with such different and varying housing markets?
Thank you, Jen. Supervisor Schultz?
Sure. So, yes, there is extensive training. In fact, our assessor for years was a property appraiser. Her father had a business. She grew up learning that. She's been she was our assistant assessor for years. She has been an assessor for many years. Lots of training. The one thing I will say, though, so we have 12,000 homes. We have 14,000 properties in Henrietta alone that have to be reassessed. The assessor cannot pick the comparables for each and every one of them when you're doing a townwide reassessment. So there's something called mass appraisal software that makes those choices. They're not always the best. On our website, we have all the information in there as to all the different sales, how you can go about and pick different comparables. That's one of the things that is the biggest thing that we see in the informals. You come in with better comparable choices. If she agrees those are better choices, she can change your assessment right there. And if you're happy with the new number, you're done. You don't have to file a formal grievance. Unfortunately, that window is very small. The schedule, the calendar is dictated by the state, and they don't have a lot of time between when the notices go out and when they have to wrap up informals, because they have to start putting together the preliminary tax roll that has to be out by May 1st. But even so, you can still challenge your comparables, and we encourage everybody, if your comparables don't make sense, challenge them, because that's one of the easiest things to do. But, you've got to pick ones that are the right sales, and those are all online to make it easy for people.
I'm going to follow up that point in a second. Jen, thank you. Good question. Naomi, just briefly, this is like a yes or no for the supervisor. Can towns across New York join together and put pressure on Albany to change to a real estate tax system such as Steve suggests, and should Steve be the assessment czar? I added the last part. But
I don't know if I want to be the assessment czar, but yes, we can team together. There is something called the Association of Towns. We have talked to them about it. They help push legislation. The big thing is talk to your legislators, so your assembly member and your senator. Tell them that this is a huge concern and that we need to see change in Albany, and if you don't, we're going to primary you out. One of the things we always talk about is, unfortunately, where politics has gotten today, most people don't vote for the other party. Well, then threaten them with that they'll be primaried out. Because it's got to change. It really is broken, and it's going to drive people out of the state. and out of their homes. Someone shouldn't lose their homes because they can't afford to pay taxes. That's crazy.
All right, real briefly here, LW says, lives in Henrietta. Hearing our supervisor, I went to look online, and it looks as though the requirement for a professional assessment may have dropped. He was saying that you had to hire a professional like a contractor in order to file a grievance, and it got very complicated. He says, we've missed the opportunity to file an informal request for review, but do you still have to do that in Henrietta?
So you can file a formal grievance without needing to hire. You know, the three basic ways you attack your the assessment. One is choose different comparables. The second is show that there are condition issues with your house. It's an aging roof. It's a sagging roof. I've got a crack in the foundation. I've got 1950s kitchen and bathrooms, that kind of stuff. And then the third one is a professional real estate appraisal. That one will cost money. Depending on how much you think it's off, it may be worth it. But the other two don't cost money. Again, if you go onto the town website, under government, click assessors. In the upper left corner, you'll see grievance information. It's got all the forms there needed to file your grievance. It's got worksheets to help you do it. It's got all the sales books so you can pick comparables that make the most sense. They're organized by the type of, is it a split level? Is it a ranch? Is it, and so on. I hear music playing.
We're playing you out, Supervisor Schultz. Supervisor Steve Schultz of the town of Henrietta, and perhaps the future assessment czar of New York State. Thank you for making time for the program today, Mr. Supervisor.
My pleasure.
Great having you. And I want to say again, Brian Sharp corrected me, but I'm going to say it again. Follow Brian and Gino's coverage to understand what's going on with Brighton and their assessment. 10 seconds. They're starting again. Again, it's not starting.
They'll do a reassessment in another year or two. They'll go through this process. For now, they're essentially standing down. Your values might change if you made major improvements. Otherwise, expect a new statement with a back to more what you saw before.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Gino.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Brian Sharp, from all of us at Connections, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Talk to you tomorrow. Thank you, guys. Steve, you got a lot of...
This program is a production of WXXI Public Radio. The views expressed do not necessarily represent those of this station, its staff, management, or underwriters. The broadcast is meant for the private use of our audience. Any rebroadcast or use in another medium without expressed written consent of WXXI is strictly prohibited. Connections with Evan Dawson is available as a podcast. Just click on the Connections link at WXXInews.org.